What is the role of tenderness in Black radicalism?
What is the role of tenderness in Black radicalism?
What is the role of tenderness in Black radicalism?
What is the role of tenderness in Black radicalism?
This is for the African kings and queens, those without thrones, with crowns made out of thorns crucified. You have a birthmark the size of Africa on your chest. They said you are a target for wars. They turned your playgrounds into a holocaust of African boys and girls swimming in a cascade of rape. They said you were ape strong, animal kingdom hazardous, so they silenced every bone in your body with a trigger. Because the bullet never seems to miss someone like me. They say we were born astride our graves, and our mother's womb was an isolation cell the night before our execution. That her breasts were grenades ready to explode the first time we settled on them. African women, how do you continue giving birth to ghosts? We are moved by the prayers of a Nigerian mother whose daughter hasn't come home yet, a mother who knows that her daughter never will. Have a tsunami of tears not cleansed enough battlefields, because it seems when we are born black in this world, there's a tombstone with your name engraved on it. Maybe it's because our mother's lullabies sounded too much like funeral hymns when we were growing up. Born in a world where everything bad is associated with black markets, blacklisted, black fathers, where they even have us wearing black in our own funerals, comforted by mahogany boxes that hung us tighter than our fathers ever will. Our knees are tired, and it seems like the church pew is too expensive for God to hear our prayers. We're born in a world where we are born rebels and abominations. We African kings and queens were told that we have our hearts the size of our fists. That's why we loved in punches. But this is for the African kings and queens. The world must never forget that we built an entire nation with our bare hands, that we are the respiratory to this universe, that we are beautiful and strange, and it scares me.
Hello everybody, welcome to the first episode of Navigating the Millennial Dissonance. My name is Nicole Sithole, and I'm so excited to introduce Sia and Sechaba today as we have our conversation on Black radicalism and tenderness. And after that excellent performance, I'd just like to start off the conversation with asking you guys, do you identify as Black radicals? And if you do, where does that fit into the work that you do, into your art?
Very interesting question. Thank you so much for having us. For me, I think Black radicalism is not necessarily, I think, a choice for many Black people, particularly because, especially if you're an artist, when they become conscious of themselves in terms of their status in the world and what kind of positions and representations that have been made of them as people of color, one realizes, the immediate necessity to continuously produce work that is not only provocative, but that will recreate the idea of how the Black subject has been represented throughout time. The piece actually that I've shared was quite a very timeless piece. I wrote it in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a piece that I wrote at the beginning of my consciousness, I believe. When you're growing up, you constantly pick this idea of you could reach for anything that you want to reach for. It's instilled in you. You work hard and so forth, and you realize that particular Black representations of self are continuous, despite what position you hold in society. Really influenced me to outline really how negative the Black identity has been, and therefore in trying to reshape those ideas, Black radicalism is an automatic, I suppose, product of that experience. But yeah, I'm sure Sia, we're here. on that.
Yeah, I echo what Sechaba is saying, because I'm thinking again, going back to the poem that he mentioned, because that would have also been the time that we met for the first time in Cape Town, almost 10 years ago. And there was a particular resonance in our own work. In fact, I remember having, identified myself as a protest poet, which is quite akin, I think, to this notion of Black radicalism, and how one embodies that. And how it has now a place in the kind of work that I continue to do as an historian and as somebody who's interested in the cultural dimension of Black radicalism through the work that I do on investigating the role, the history, and the intellectual contribution of Black South African artists in exile. That is how that particular term has, in a sense, followed me from the time I began writing as a protest poet or identifying as a protest poet, to now being, in a sense, a cultural and intellectual historian who is interested no longer particularly with my own inflection of what that means, but who's interested in tracing the history of where some of the impulses that might have otherwise inspired me to begin. Mm-hmm. So where it situates itself now in my work is in the lives that I'm interested in the lives that I'm interested, who identified, of course, I'm sure, as Black radicals, but at the same time who are quite intentional about what this Black radicalism will, in a sense, position itself in the broader political anti-apartheid narrative, because these were, as I said, artists, and they were interested in the cultural dimension of Black radicalism, which has, in South African historiography, in a sense, occupied a quite marginalized role, because when we talk about Black radicalism, I suppose, in South African history, in the anti-apartheid struggle, we do tend to, attribute some of the efforts of that movement to political leaders, and artists, precisely because of their own transgressive relationship with the apartheid state. Many of them were banned because they said things that were, against the Pretoria regime. Many of them found themselves in exile, and so they did not become part of the South African psychology when South Africa is free in '94, and also when one looks at around education, they also did not become part of the South African narrative or curriculum, for that matter. And so my role now, as somebody who has, in a sense, evolved into an historian from being an artist, because I entered the academy, with all the suspicions an artist would have about the university as a place to imagine ideas. And so my role now has to bridge the two, my own sense of becoming a Black radical in my poetry to now archiving or attending to the archive of Black radicalism in South Africa. And that's what it means to me now. And that's the contribution I think I'm making in this evolving conversation about Black radicalism and tenderness, because these are artists, and there's something about art, unlike raw politics, unlike, which is I suppose, precisely because of its form, a form that appeals to everyone. There's music, poetry, visual art, and what have you. There's a sense of tenderness about revolting through forms which appeal to the human race than a particular, category or group or nationality of people.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And I'm glad you've started touching on tenderness as well. And as you know, I'm a historian of gender. And I was thinking about this idea of tenderness and how historically in many cultures and societies it's been associated with femininity. So I was wondering what you guys think about this idea of tenderness within Black radicalism and in the work that you do. How has it shaped your own masculinity and the way you express yourself in your work?
I mean, the idea of tenderness really has been an eye-opener in terms of also how one navigates their Blackness, in particular when when one looks at the common stereotypes that have been built around the black identity, and the certain stereotypes that we grew up, being taught, in terms of patriarchy, in terms of living in a very heteronormative society, and being very, I suppose, masculine even in our behaviors as young boys growing up in the township. There are certain things that we were taught to do amongst each other, which when one then began to move into the art space, I think it opened up a different plethora of ideas in terms of how one could then navigate themselves around other subjects who were othered just like we have been as a race. So for me, I guess this idea of tenderness has allowed me to really be more sympathetic as well, to the way in which people, gain consciousness of self, and the way we educate each other. And I think art has been quite a crucial medium that allows one to then begin a conversation, to say, listen, I know this is what we've been taught, this is what we think we should be doing, but all of these things were created by a particular power dynamic which in society, I suppose, is navigated through race, class and gender. And now that one is becoming more conscious of the self, I think tenderness really played a very integral role, and art in itself is that tenderness, I suppose. See in him, moving into a historical space, trying to find those voices that existed before and make them known is a form of radicalism, because the norm of society now would be us to move towards a particular idea of being, of self, because the world tries to create this very monolithic idea of who the human is, So having then, people who still go against the norm in terms of what kind of work that they produce is in itself a radical act, because there isn't any model that says this, what we're doing now, is going to create this tender life, soft life that we would love to have, But instead, it really preserves our cultures and our identities, so that future generations can look back and be like, oh, this is what we used to do, or this is what we do, this is who we are.
I shy away from the big term, black radicalism, but as you've said that, it really bubbles up something inside me, because I'm very much interested in how we perceive ourselves within our, how we understand our gendered identities. I grew up in a family with very strong women, and I didn't see that. I didn't see the space that allowed for such strong women in our society. It was constantly challenged, almost as a threat to masculinity. But when I was looking from the outside in as a young child, I saw that strength in women as something that complemented and worked with masculinity, and that's what got me interested in studying gender, and looking at gender in this way in itself is kind of radical, and saying it's allowed, it's okay, it's acceptable to be whatever you want to be as a man, as a woman. I want to hone in on your performances now and talk a little bit about the actual art in itself of playing the piano and the spoken word. And what strikes out to me as I watch you guys perform is the vulnerability and the beauty that arises from that vulnerability. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the actual performance, the communication between the music and the poetry itself. What can you say a little bit about that? Maybe about your relationship as artists and how you've adapted to the new environment, being in the United Kingdom, coming from South Africa, getting here, and how maybe the performance has evolved as you've moved from one place to the other.
Wow. I was listening to Sia earlier on. He spoke about the fact that he's no longer a poet, or does not.
I'm a recovering poet.
Recovering poet, I've also had my own, I suppose, difficulties with, spoken word over the past few years, primarily because of what you've just mentioned, of how vulnerable one becomes, when you put pen to paper. It's usually, for me, I guess, even through the writing process, it would happen after something that would really be life-changing for me would happen, and that's when I would feel that this was an outlet and need to reflect on these moments. So it's a moment of introspection, really, in terms of the poetry itself. And I've moved past that phase of reflecting on my own life to trying to capture other people's lives. And that's why now the interest in film, the interest in animation, the interest in actually writing stories, from all the stories I've heard from different individuals, because I think there's so much to learn. And I think Sia spoke about this earlier on, about navigating, in terms of masculinity and tenderness and so forth, is that one has grown up now to understand that there are many more stories out there, and men have always had the platform to talk, and the act of listening is quite a profound one, to listen to what society and other people, members of society, have to say, and capturing that and archiving it has become now an integral part of what I want to do, moving on in terms of my craft. So we were actually laughing about it earlier on, about how I'm protesting poetry. Like, I don't want to do poetry no more, But I realize that poetry is not necessarily just the written text, but just it's a continuous process, of reflection, and you could reflect in different mediums. In itself, that is poetry for me. You don't have to necessarily be on stage, and I think that there are traditional definitions of things, and I think the more we are able to define, certain spaces for ourselves, we're able to change the meaning. If we can change the meaning, then we're able to make significant impact in certain spaces without being so scholarlistic. Is that the word?
And I mean, on the question of the UK, and of course us finding ourselves here almost 10 years after we said, you know, our first poems all those years ago in Cape Town when we met. almost 10 years. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. For me, you know, Sechaba and I, when we spoke about the possibilities of, you know, our work in this new context, in this new country, and of course had our first, you know, performance offering Mogoelelwa a few months ago in Cambridge, it was clear to us that, you know, notwithstanding the almost decade gap between our first performance and what became our most recent one, that some of the things that we otherwise preoccupied ourselves with and some of the difficult questions we asked about ourselves, about our society, about our country, about love. Sechaba was a love poet.
Oh no,
he is. You know,
no ways.
Those are still things that resonate today. And this is what I mentioned earlier. This is what I meant earlier when I said it's interesting to go back to that archive of our younger selves and discern certain patterns which, you know, would still be relevant today. Yeah. Sechaba read a poem earlier that he wrote in 2013, which it would seem that he wrote a fortnight ago. And so, as creatives, it's been quite clear to us that, you know, one, and I say this with a great deal of humility, when we were young all those years ago, we had, in a sense, foresaw or been so prescient in our observations about, you know, the world that we live in, that they are, you know, in a very frightening way, quite relevant and still things that one, you know, has occasion to think about now. And so in terms of the music and the poetry, it's certainly been one consistent thing that Sechaba and I have had. I mean, we've moved between instruments, guitar, and now it's piano with all its new possibilities as well. Listening more than talking. I think we consider ourselves as spoken word artists. Now we consider ourselves as artists, you know, and people who are interested to share, to exchange, to listen, to absorb, and to, in a sense, ventilate that in different forms through music. For me, for Sechaba, through film, through photography, and it's now in the kinds of ways that perhaps South Africa did not provide us when we were beginning as writers. We are now interested in a dialogue than, you know, us being on stage and being listened to. Yeah. We are also listening to each other more in new ways that, you know, we probably did not have the vocabulary or appreciation or patience to do when we began as writers. So it's an interesting full circle moment which has enabled us to take stock of what happened between the first poem and the last, but also how we've also evolved and how that work, in a sense, is a mind map of all those important nodes that one goes through in their life. But for us as artists, most importantly, those turning points that will have a bearing on the kind of work that we will do in the future.
too late. The ground would have swallowed you whole, your name washed away from every shoreline by the wave of your own existence. You will not be remembered here. We will not sing songs about you. You will not find your name in the Bible verses where you tried to find yourself. And you will cry, pleading to the Almighty for peace and prosperity until those tears have cleansed all your wounds like a newborn, silent because you have been pregnant with emptiness. And you will try to run, but don't, because your feet will not be able to carry the melanin that is your skin. And you will try to swim, but don't, because black boys don't swim. Black boys cannot survive sea because sea is slave ship, and slave ship is black boys' freedom. You obituary for a birth certificate thing, casket for a graduation gown thing, hand held up in the air, you are a target thing, nameless thing. And someday you will curse your mother's uterus for giving birth to black things, dead things.